CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Corruption accompanied by the illicit financial flows deprives each year Africa of more than $50 billion. The figures speak for themselves. All the African nations are concerned in one way or the other, one degree to the other. The struggle has to be a global struggle, and this can only be won through our collective action.
The African Union has earmarked 2018 as the continent's year against graft, with the theme of the recently concluded African Union Summit, Winning the Fight Against Corruption, a Sustainable Path to Africa's Transformation. A broad theme and a tough task for African nations, but it comes at a time when efforts to ensure greater transparency in government are increasingly paying off, even if there has so far been little success in relation to ruling parties and sitting heads of state in Africa. So then, what were the major outcomes of the discussions at the 30th African Union Summit? And what will it take for Africa to win its war against corruption? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. African leaders have committed to working together to fight corruption and terrorism on the continent. As he was wrapping up the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, incoming chairperson Paul Kagame said reforms require a complete change of mindset. CGTN's Girum Chala has more.
For 2 days, African Union heads of state have discussed how to win the fight against corruption, combat terrorism, and implement continent-wide reforms.
We have just concluded a very successful African Union Summit with the major decisions that will go a long way in helping the continent achieve its short, medium, long-term goals.
The AU Commission has the mandate to coordinate the implementation of these resolutions. It says ending corruption is a priority this year.
We have the judiciary, we have the control institutions, we have all. That is, we need to carry out a merciless fight against corruption. We have the various mechanisms at the level state, so we have a methodological work.
Incoming AU chairperson, Rwanda's President Paul Kagame says reforms are vital for Africa's transformation to improve the lives of people on the ground. And for this to happen, there needs to be a change in mindset.
So when we have been looking at, for example, how and where do we get resources from? But we can generate resources from our own countries to begin with, so that if there is any help and assistance from the ones known as partners, then the support will come adding to our own efforts. I think that is very important.
One of the reforms is a levy. Each member is expected to contribute to help the African Union become self-sustainable. So far, around 20 countries have opened their purses, meaning there is a long way to go to get all 50-plus members on board. Group Dala CGTN at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa.
Now, in line with this year's theme, the African Union is launching a large-scale campaign against corruption across the continent this year. The operation, guided by the theme Fighting Corruption in Africa, will include naming, shaming, as well as a cross-continent collaborative effort to detain and arrest corrupt individuals. Girum Chala spoke to the African Union Commission's Deputy Chair, Kwesi Kote, to find out how they plan to achieve this.
The report from President Thabo Mbeki showed the enormous leakages of capital from this continent. Basically, as a result of corruption. And we are not talking about corruption of individual members. We're talking about corruption on a large scale, institutionalized, sometimes embedded in laws, and effected by otherwise very respectable corporations. You know, President Buhari is a champion, and he has been one African leader who has stood out in his fight against corruption from when he was a military leader to when he became a civilian leader, and he's as good a symbol as any that you find anywhere.
So I understand, based on the African Union practice, after the decisions made out of this summit, all year 2018, there are going to be lots of things to be done in accordance with the idea of fighting corruption in Africa. Can you walk us through what is going to be done in 2018 according to the theme?
The more effective way of combating corruption is by having laws, institutions, and courts and officials who pursue matters to their logical conclusion, and to bring the breath of fresh air and sunlight into all operations. So we're going to have increasing transparency, we're going to have increasing publicity, we're going to have a celebration of institutions and people who have done well, but have done that transparently in accordance with the rule of law.
So how are member states going to come into the picture? After all, it's within the member states and other institutions as well that we are significantly seeing the trouble that comes out of corrupt activities and attitude.
The burden of the African Union is to set the agenda and to bring out the theme. And if you do it clearly and convincingly enough, it percolates to its various subdivisions. And the effective work on that is going to be undertaken by the various states who are still sovereign entities.
I think the theme is very important as we consider the corruption also as one of the triggers of conflicts, because overall it's about governance, and in governance we have political governance, we have economical governance, and it is important that we really address this issue very seriously.
That was the African Union Commissioner for Peace and Security, Ismail Chergui, speaking about the theme of this year's African Union Summit, winning the fight against corruption. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, staying on the theme of anti-corruption on the continent, it's not all bad news. In South Africa, the Office of the Public Protector serves as an anti-graft watchdog, and it's at the forefront of the fight. CGTN's Yolisa Njamela has more.
Corruption has become pervasive in both the private and public sectors in South Africa. Perpetrators often have little regard for the law. Countless studies around the world show that corruption has the potential to restrict trade, interrupt investment, and reduce economic growth.
It's too bad for the population to bear, and it underpins huge political instability. It underpins many of the service delivery protests that we're talking about. It definitely diverts public resources from where they should go to into the pockets of a few.
A 2016 Corruption Watch report indicates that the most prevalent types of corruption reported over the past few years center on the abuse of power, followed by bribery and procurement corruption. South Africa's anti-corruption watchdog, the Public Protector, has the power to investigate, report on, and remedy improper conduct in all state affairs. The body has been at the forefront of fighting this menace. The latest high-profile corruption case investigated by this office relates to 300 million rand misspent for the funeral of former President Nelson Mandela in December 2013. Some officials and service providers used the funeral to steal from state coffers. But while this office often makes inroads in the fight against corruption, it's the lack of resources that hinder progress.
Institutions like the Public Protector and other Chapter 9 institutions or constitutional institutions which are responsible to fight corruption. And since corruption is a scourge which affects or impedes development in any country, they need to be well-resourced, well-funded. So that is the biggest challenge I'm facing as a Public Protector. Corruption impedes development. At the end of the day, who suffers? The very same people which we are supposed to be protecting.
While there is no immediate cure for corruption, many believe that ethical leadership and political will be a huge leap towards creating one. Yudisa Njomela, CGTN, Pretoria, South Africa.
And now to provide some more insights into the decisions taken at the African Union Summit around Africa's war on corruption, I have expert guest standing by in Abuja, Edwin Ikworia. He's a policy manager at Transparency International and Accountability at the One Campaign in Nigeria. And in Johannesburg, Gareth Van Onselen. He's the head of politics and governance at the South African Institute of Race Relations. Thank you both for joining in the conversation. Edwin, in Abuja, first I'll start with you. The African Union has made fighting corruption a key focus for the continent in 2018. First, your thoughts on that decision, and is the African Union now taking the lead in fighting corruption on the continent?
Yes, I think this was very welcome because it's an admission of the fact that corruption is a problem across the continent, not just in one country. And I think that is a reason why right now it's really exciting to see that it has become a theme for the year. Usually before now, there has been several themes, of various sectors and various things they want to achieve, particularly in relation to the Agenda 2063. But thinking that and knowing that, realizing that corruption is a key factor in determining or achieving progress in other sectors is something that is really welcome. And that's why we are really, really hailing that decision for this year.
Gareth, your thoughts on that? This is a welcome position from the African Union, isn't it?
Yes, I don't think there's any circumstance in which an anti-corruption position wouldn't be welcomed. The problem, of course, is that corruption across the African continent seems to be escalating to such a degree that the African Union has had to make it a theme for this year. And I think that is just as powerful a message as the fact that they have chosen to address it directly. In other words, the problem is escalating, and the real test of whether or not the African Union is able to impact is not whether or not it can identify it as a theme, but whether or not it can introduce policies and programs of action that are widely accepted and which have a direct effect on corruption throughout the continent.
Well, Gareth, when you talk about the extent of corruption is escalating across the continent, quantify that corruption for us. What is the magnitude on the continent, and what is the impact this has had on the socio-economic lives of the populations?
Well, it's a very difficult thing to quantify corruption because a lot of the loss of revenue is not recorded. They are through graft inside state governments, through tender deals that are hidden or have hidden costs in them that benefit private individuals. But the amounts run into staggeringly huge numbers, and it's one of the great obstacles to economic growth on the continent. And the problem lies in many cases with individual states and governments and their attitude towards corruption. South Africa, where I'm from, for example, has a very good local set of rules, some very powerful legislation to address corruption, but it lacks the will within the state to implement those things. And so the AU has to find some way between connecting between its will and the will of these individual states to ensure that the problem is addressed.
Gareth, the African Union did hear, though, that about $150 billion is lost annually on the continent through corrupt processes, though. And when you look at the way different countries are fighting corruption, you find that there are certain countries like Mauritius and Rwanda doing much better than countries such as Kenya and South Africa that you have just mentioned. What is it that works for one country and isn't working for the other?
Well, I think there are a number of ingredients which play into whether or not a state is willing and able to directly address corruption. The first is that you need a legislative mandate that outlaws corruption, that is powerful and allows you to prosecute people that commit crimes. The second is you need a political dispensation, a state and a governing party that has the will to tackle corruption directly. There needs to be an anti-corruption culture within that state to pursue it. And the third thing is that those consequences need to be seen to be believed. People need to be prosecuted so that a society understands there are consequences for actions.
Right. Edwin, though, to you, because I just heard from Gareth about the disparities in fighting corruption in the various countries. Are there different determinants, though, in the fight against corruption in the various countries? What is it that is working, for instance, for Nigeria that is probably not working for South Africa or is working for Cape Verde?
I think that we can take it from many dimensions. The question is whether the emphasis is on the enforcement of when corruption has happened already, because that is what seems to make the news, you know. But I think the key part or the key reform that we hope to see is when steps are taken to prevent corruption from happening. So we are expecting to see institutional reforms. In Nigeria, for instance, there has been the major issue of public procurement because, as you know, 80% of the government revenue comes from a source, which is oil. And for that reason, all expenditure, you see most of the states come to the center to get money every month, you know, but when government procurement takes such a huge place or such a huge part of the economy, you need to put processes in place to avoid, you know, it being used to siphon public funds. And that is why all of the measures that is necessary to ensure that no singular person, no singular individual is able to withdraw public funds or withdraw public money without getting the attention of the rest. You know, these are the kind of reforms we hope to see. In Nigeria, for instance, there is the TSA that has happened, the Treasury single account, and which consolidates all of government revenue into one purse at the CBN. And the only way of withdrawal is through one system. And so when any withdrawal is being made or any allocation is being made or any expenditure is being made, it comes to the attention of everybody who is monitoring that whole space. So these are the kind of things we hope to see in terms of preventive measures, you know, that we think can bring institutional changes that can really help the fight against corruption. I think Nigeria is currently on the path to, you know, to doing those things that we think can actually help that fight.
But Edwin, we do know that the African Union is not short on policy, and when it comes to implementation exactly, then what exactly are we expecting from the African Union when they talk about taking the lead in fighting corruption?
So first of all, the first thing is to understand that the African Union is not an entity that can implement policies in the member states. That we need to understand first. But it's a platform for creating an agenda. And the agenda has been created, which is what we are quite excited about, so that across African states, they need to now begin to take steps at the country level that can see that this agenda that has been created at the African Union can actually be implemented at the country levels. What we hope to see now is the agenda to be followed up with concrete actions in each of the member states, reviewing where it stands right now, reviewing its current position. For instance, there is the African Union Convention for Prevention of Corruption that about 22 states thereabout haven't signed on to. They haven't acceded to. We need to see that become a key part of the policies that the African Union is going to push. And then the other part is to see that when they come in July, by the time the African Union states come in July, they come with concrete deliverables to say, this is what we have experienced in our country. This is where we stand against corruption. This is what we want to do against corruption. At least the African Union can help drive that agenda. And this is what we hope to see to be the next steps.
Gareth, are you optimistic, though, that you're going to see much decision from the African Union, that the African Union is actually going to be able to make this a reality when it comes to even domesticating whatever the African Union wants done?
Well, no, I don't hold out high hopes that a lot of the nation states that comprise the African Union are going to comply or show the necessary will to match the anti-corruption agenda that the AU has put forward. And it's true that in 2063 there are concrete proposals now on paper that these states need to comply with, but there have been plans before that have not yet amounted to much. I mean, the AU doesn't talk these days about the African Renaissance anymore. The peer review mechanism that was part of NAPAD doesn't feature prominently in its rhetoric, and it certainly failed to deliver concrete results. It seems to just be a bureaucratic process that states comply with because it exists. And this desire to actually deliver outcomes in terms of the AU's program seems to be what's lacking. There seems to be a lack of anyone who's willing to put themselves forward to lead by example and to set a sort of continental standard for change.
Right. Edwin, you mentioned, though, that this is not the first time that the African Union has tried to address that issue of corruption, because the African Union actually adopted a convention to curb corruption in the continent some 15 years ago. Where are we with that?
So I think it is more than just launching or giving a convention. It's about implementation at the country level, and that takes political will. I think, like the other guests have said, political will and political leadership for these conventions that have been put by the African Union. We are hoping to see that they need to drive the agenda more forcefully in terms of having country level consultations, so that if the agenda or the ideas that are presented in the conventions can actually be domesticated. The word is domestication. So we all have to come to the reality of how corruption manifests in each member state. And that is where I think the African Union needs to put a lot more effort this time around, now that it has become the agenda, for the whole year.
Right, Gareth, as we wind down here, just give us a feeling of, in your view, though, how does one deal with the question of corruption? How do you solve Africa's corruption problem? How would you go about solving Africa's corruption problem?
Well, first of all, and it's unfortunate to say this, but I don't think there is a one policy solution or a set of 3 simple changes that you can do that can turn this kind of thing around. The way in which corruption manifests differs from country to country, and it's true that there are common themes, but the different legislative frameworks, different political powers, different ways in which democracy is constituted means it's very difficult to have a universal rule. Nevertheless, institutions like the African Union can be helpful. The problem with them is that they are founded on a kind of moral compact. They don't have that ability to enforce the decisions or resolutions they take, and they rely on nation states to basically implicitly agree that there is a high moral standard with which they must comply. And if those nation states go home to their own business and just regard that as empty talk or rhetoric and don't actually embody it, then it doesn't really count for much. And this is the conundrum that organizations, not just like the AU, the United Nations as well, face, is they rely almost entirely on moral pressure, and if that moral will doesn't exist in the nation states, they are proved to be ineffective.
Edwin, do you think that the national governments will adopt what the African Union has set out? Do you think that that moral compass of the African Union will filter down to the member states?
Okay, so I think that from many dimensions, I totally agree that is true, that they need the moral pressure to be able to do this. But I think they also live with the consequences. Because African states, African governments, they've seen right now that the way things are going socioeconomically for the citizens of Africa, it's only getting worse, and they have no reason anymore, to doubt whether corruption is a problem. And I think because they've seen the consequences of this, they've seen the young people die at sea, they've seen, children die before they are 5 years old, they've seen, a lot of individuals getting rich off of the state. They know that it is no longer sustainable. The inequality, the figures are stark. They can no longer just, overlook it anymore. So I think right now, even if they don't want to, if they don't want riots on their hands, if they don't want conflict in their hands, if they don't want, social vices to escalate, they must deal with this issue. And that is why we think that they have an incentive in terms of the rate of development. They have an incentive as per the moral pressure. They have reasons right now to take action other than the way it has been happening before. So I am very hopeful and very optimistic that something better will happen this year, or starting from this year.
Right, Gareth, you do have the final word on this, because you did not sound very optimistic. At the end of the year, with the current theme of corruption, what is it that you hope you will see that the governments will have done?
Well, I hope that the attitudes and the rhetoric and the kind of language that's been on display at the African Union and the priorities that the African Union has put forward, primarily a stance on anti-corruption, are replicated in the individual nation states. I hope that those countries do particular things in this regard. One of the most important is that the role of the judiciary across the continent needs to be elevated and understood as quintessential in the fight against corruption. Its independence needs to be maintained, and it needs to be able to give them the resources and expertise to implement these various decisions. Because once you've got the will and once you've got the legislation, it is up to the judiciary and the justice system to implement these things. And in a lot of African countries, they are under-resourced and underfunded and marginalized, and that's what I would hope to see change.
Right, gentlemen, we'll leave it there for the moment. That's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Abuja, Edwin Ikworia, Policy Manager, Transparency and Accountability at the One Campaign in Nigeria. In Johannesburg, Gareth Van Onselen, the Head of Politics and Governance at the South African Institute of Race Relations. Remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.